Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about why the Crimea corridor has always been Russia's weak spot. At first glance, the corridor might look like a symbol of Russian strength, a physical and political connection between mainland Russia and the annexed peninsula of Crimea. But beneath that image lies a series of deep vulnerabilities. Geography, logistics, economics, and politics have all turned what was supposed to be a symbol of power into a fragile lifeline that Russia constantly struggles to protect. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it saw the peninsula as a prize that restored its presence in the Black Sea and gave it control over the important port of Sevastopol. But geography has its own rules. Crimea is surrounded by water on three sides, with only a narrow strip of land connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Once Ukraine cut off access and supplies from the north, Russia was forced to rely on alternative routes that were never designed to handle full-scale military or civilian logistics. From that moment on, sustaining Crimea became one of Russia's most challenging tasks. The solution Russia created was the Kerch Bridge, an enormous structure linking Crimea to the Russian mainland across the Kerch Strait. When it opened in 2018, it became one of Russia's proudest achievements. It symbolized the permanence of Russian control and the triumph of engineering over geography. Yet, the same bridge quickly became one of Russia's greatest vulnerabilities. It is long, exposed, and impossible to fully protect. When explosions damaged it in 2022, the event shocked Russia's leadership and public alike. The strike proved that Crimea could be cut off from its lifeline in a single moment. The Kerch Bridge carries both road and rail traffic, supplying food, fuel, ammunition, and everything needed for life and warfare in Crimea. But because it is the only direct connection from Russia, any damage to it causes immediate disruption. Repairs take months, and even partial closures slow the movement of supplies. Every truck or train that crosses it is a reminder of how dependent Russia is on this single piece of infrastructure. The bridge is a symbol of ambition, turned into a strategic liability. To complement the bridge, Russia established a land corridor running along the southern coast of Ukraine, through areas like Mariupol, Melitopol, and Berdyansk. This land corridor connects Crimea to Russia's Rostov region, but this route lies within a war zone. Ukraine's military operates close enough to threaten it with artillery, drones, and long-range missiles. Each segment of this corridor has become a potential target, and keeping it secure demands constant patrols, air defense, and troop deployments. For Russia, defending the corridor has become an endless burden. The infrastructure along this route is limited. The railway lines are mostly single-track, non-electrified, and have restricted capacity. They were never intended to support the full logistical needs of a modern army. A single destroyed bridge or tunnel can halt traffic for days or even weeks. This lack of redundancy means that the entire supply system is always at risk. Russia must constantly repair, reinforce, and reroute its logistics just to keep Crimea functional. The geography of southern Ukraine compounds this vulnerability. The flat, open terrain provides little cover, making convoys and trains easy targets. Ukraine has taken advantage of this by striking fuel depots, ammunition trains, and bridges. These attacks may not always destroy the corridor completely, but they keep it unstable. In modern warfare, logistics must be continuous, and even temporary disruption can have major consequences. The Black Sea adds another layer of complexity. On one hand, it gives Russia naval access and a platform for its fleet. On the other hand, it exposes Russia to maritime threats. Ukraine's use of drones, missiles, and naval raids has forced Russia to move parts of its Black Sea fleet away from Sevastopol to ports further east. This relocation shows that Crimea, once a symbol of naval strength, is now a risky place to keep valuable assets. The sea, that was supposed to protect Russia's presence in Crimea, has become a dangerous zone of vulnerability. Economically, Crimea depends almost entirely on supplies from Russia. Since 2014, the region has been under sanctions, isolated from international trade, and cut off from Ukrainian resources. Food, energy, and materials must be imported from across the Kerch Bridge or through the land corridor. Any disruption sends prices soaring and creates shortages for civilians. This constant dependence transforms the peninsula from a self-sustaining region into a permanent economic drain on Russia's budget. Water shortages have also been a persistent problem. When Ukraine closed the North Crimean Canal, which had supplied most of Crimea's fresh water, agriculture and industry on the peninsula suffered badly. Russia tried to compensate by drilling wells and building desalination plants, but none of these fully replaced the canal's capacity. The water issue remains a symbol of Crimea's dependence on external sources. Politically, Crimea represents one of Russia's most significant symbolic victories. The annexation was presented domestically as the restoration of historical justice and the revival of national pride. For President Putin, Crimea became a cornerstone of his legitimacy, but that symbolic value also makes it a strategic trap. Because Crimea carries such political importance, Russia cannot afford to lose it or even risk appearing unable to defend it. This forces Moscow to pour enormous resources into its defense, regardless of cost or practicality. Ukraine understands this perfectly. By targeting the corridor, Ukraine can achieve major strategic effects without launching a full invasion of the peninsula. Each successful strike on a bridge, depot, or convoy forces Russia to spend time, money, and manpower on repairs. It also undermines Russia's narrative of control and stability. The corridor is not only a logistical weakness, but also a psychological one. It shows the world that Russia's hold on Crimea depends on fragile infrastructure and constant effort. From a military perspective, Crimea has become an overextended position. It is far from Russia's main supply centers, dependent on narrow transport routes, and surrounded by hostile territory. The longer Russia holds it, the more vulnerable it becomes. Any serious Ukrainian breakthrough in the Zaporizhzhia region could cut the land corridor entirely, isolating tens of thousands of Russian troops and civilians on the peninsula. Such a situation would be disastrous for Moscow, both militarily and politically. Defending Crimea requires thousands of troops who might otherwise serve on active fronts. Air defenses, coastal batteries, and radar systems must constantly monitor the skies and sea for threats. Maintaining this level of readiness is expensive and exhausting. Every missile fired at a drone, every truckload of supplies sent across the bridge, and every convoy escorted along the corridor adds to the cumulative strain on Russia's war effort. Russia's logistical doctrine has always emphasized the importance of secure supply lines. Yet in Crimea, that principle is constantly violated. The lines are long, exposed, and easy to disrupt. In wartime, the efficiency of supply often determines the outcome of battles. Without stable logistics, even the best-equipped forces lose their effectiveness. Crimea's dependence on distant, vulnerable links makes it an example of how geography can defeat even large armies. The economic burden is growing as well. Russia must subsidize Crimea heavily to maintain a semblance of normal life. Roads, hospitals, and power stations all rely on funding from Moscow. As the war continues, these costs rise while revenue declines. Sanctions have cut off Crimea from tourism and international investment. The result is a region that looks stable on maps but is financially dependent on Russia's strained economy. The civilian population of Crimea lives under constant uncertainty. Supply shortages, fuel disruptions, and transportation delays are common. The destruction or closure of the Kerch Bridge immediately affects daily life. Residents experience first, and the consequences of living in a territory that relies on a single vulnerable connection for survival. Over time, this erodes confidence and weakens morale. From the strategic point of view, Crimea is no longer the advantage it once seemed to be. It still holds value as a naval base and a forward position, but its cost has grown far greater than its benefits. Holding Crimea ties down Russian resources, complicates logistics, and exposes a constant target for Ukrainian strikes. The peninsula that was meant to secure Russia's dominance in the Black Sea has become a pressure point that Ukraine exploits with increasing success. Weather and terrain add even more challenges. The narrow isthmus connecting Crimea to the mainland is difficult to fortify completely. The surrounding coastal regions are prone to flooding and seasonal storms. The Kerch Strait itself can become treacherous, especially in winter, when strong winds and ice can halt ferry traffic and make bridge maintenance dangerous. All of these natural factors increase the fragility of Russia's hold. The lack of redundancy in supply routes means there are few alternatives. If the bridge or the main railway line were to be destroyed beyond quick repair, Crimea would be effectively cut off. Air transport could not make up the difference in capacity. Sea routes are limited and vulnerable to attack. This structural dependence on a single corridor is what makes it a permanent weak spot. Over time, these vulnerabilities accumulate. The constant need for repairs, the exposure of supply lines, the high economic cost, and the political pressure to maintain control all combine to create a heavy burden. Russia is trapped in a position where it must defend something that offers little strategic flexibility. The corridor that connects Russia and Crimea is also the corridor that could one day lead to Russia's strategic retreat from the region. In contrast, Ukraine benefits from this imbalance. It does not need to occupy Crimea immediately to make holding it impossible for Russia. By targeting the weak links in the corridor, Ukraine can steadily erode Russia's ability to sustain its forces there. Each successful strike brings the peninsula closer to isolation. This indirect strategy saves resources while achieving significant strategic impact. The Crimea corridor, therefore, represents a paradox of modern warfare. It is both the reason Russia can sustain its occupation and the reason it might eventually lose it. Geography has created a situation where success and failure are separated by a narrow strip of land and a single bridge. No amount of propaganda or construction can completely remove that fundamental vulnerability. If history has taught anything, it is that overextension leads to weakness. Empires and armies that expand beyond their logistical capacity eventually falter. Crimea is a modern example of that lesson. Russia's desire to project power outweighed its ability to sustain it securely. The result is a territory that must be defended constantly, but can never be made completely safe. Looking to the future, the Crimea corridor will remain central to the conflict. As Ukraine continues to develop longer-range weapons and better intelligence, the corridor will face increasing pressure. Every new attack will remind Russia that its grip on Crimea depends on fragile connections. Unless Russia can somehow build multiple secure supply lines and ensure uncontested control over southern Ukraine, its position will remain unstable. For now, the corridor endures, but at great cost. The Kerch Bridge stands repaired but vulnerable. The land routes remain open but under constant threat. Every convoy that reaches Crimea represents another small victory for logistics over geography, but those victories are temporary. The underlying weakness remains, waiting for the next strike, the next disruption, the next shift in the war. And that is why the Crimea corridor has always been Russia's weak spot. It is a narrow, fragile link that connects ambition to reality, a line that carries the weight of a nation's pride, but cannot escape the limits of geography. The peninsula may still be under Russian control, but its lifeline is exposed, contested, and costly. In the end, that vulnerability may decide the outcome of the conflict itself.